Now for today's program. Rachel Packer is certified in exercise nutrition and forges new directions in the Jewish community by weaving a new narrative of health and wellness through a holistic Jewish lens. She is a popular freelance nutrition writer, and her articles pertaining to nutrition, food allergy, autoimmune management, and recipes have been featured in local and national magazines such as Martha Stewart Whole Living, Hadassah, Allergic Living, and the Washington Post. Rachel is a food allergy advocate and has been published in numerous web publications such as Kugel, Exploring Judaism, and Atlanta Parent. She has also appeared on many podcasts and multiple news and radio outlets as a food allergy consultant. In addition, she is a children's book author, and her book Sky High Sukkah was a PJ Library selection. Rachel is the founder of MatzoBall Fitness, because you can eat healthy and still have a ball, where she coaches clients, presents wellness programs, and cooking demos in the greater Washington, D.C. area, as well as virtually throughout the country. Please welcome Rachel Packer.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. You know, when I started out in my freelance writing career, my first article was actually published in Moment magazine. It was an article entitled, it was a personal essay actually. It was entitled The Sukkah That Ricardo Built. It was a true story based on my experience as a young girl growing up in New York, in Flushing, Queens. And my non-Jewish Haitian neighbor actually built our one and only sukkah out of wood. And it was that story that served as the inspiration for my children's book, shameless plug, Sky High Sukkah, that you mentioned before. So who knew that Moment magazine was going to be my muse? Okay, so I'm just gonna share my screen for a second so we can get started. So today we're going to be talking about let's get Nosh-talgic. That is really hard to pronounce. We're going to be connecting today with food on a nutritional, on an emotional, and a Jewish level. I am your host, Rachel Packer. I am the owner of MatzoBall Fitness, because you can eat healthy and still have a ball. It's so good to be amongst people who know, because I actually do secular nutritional programs in the workplace wellness field. And when I give my tagline, because you can eat healthy and still have a ball, I get blink, blink, blank stares. And then I have to explain what a matzo ball is. And then it's just not so funny anymore. But a lot of people ask me, why do you call it fitness? Are you a personal trainer? And the truth of the matter is that I actually used to be a personal trainer many years ago, but I was not a very good one. So I decided to keep the word fitness, because fitness doesn't always have to mean physical. There are different kinds of fitness. And we're going to be looking at this wellness triangle today. You know, the word wellness is a very big buzzword today. And the wellness space is basically just a conduit for marketers to sell you anything from, I don't know, a yoga mat to hemorrhoid cream. But there's a very specific definition for wellness, and we're going to be referring to this triangle quite a bit as we talk about food. So when we look at wellness as a triangle, we've got our three sides. We have our left side, which is our physical. This is your nutrition, your diet, whatever you eat, and your movement, your exercise, and it's also your sleep. And then we look at the mental and the emotional side. Now, our mental and emotional side, our issues dictate our behavior. So being emotionally happy doesn't necessarily mean that we're happy all the time. And it doesn't always mean that you have to stay positive all the time. Rather, mental and emotional means that we are able to sit with intense feeling, whether good or bad, sit with it, acknowledge it, and then deal appropriately with it. So by providing perhaps a creative solution to help you move past whatever issue you're in. And then there is our social and our spiritual triangles. And it's really no stretch of the imagination for us to say that our social triangles have suffered quite a bit over these last 3 years as we have shrunk to the size of our screens. And even now with pandemic, endemic, whatever you want to call it, we have limited social interaction. And then of course there is our spiritual. And this is a personal matter involving your values and your belief system that provide a purpose to your life. It's generally the search for meaning and purpose in human existence, whether that's through a connection with God or the universe or spirit or self or whatever you want to call it. And this triangle actually relates to the conversation today because we're going to be talking about food from a physical, an emotional, a social, and a spiritual angle. So I always think it's really important to let my audience know or connect with my audience in terms of what my wellness why is. If you would have told me I would have been doing this years ago, I would have laughed. But our pain to purpose stories become our missions. And my children are the impetus for me becoming very involved in this wellness sphere. Ari here, who is presently 17, when he was 2, he was diagnosed with severe food allergies to peanuts, tree nuts, citrus, and eggs. Now, this was in the early 2000s, so no Google. The internet was not very robust. Social media was in its infancy, and we didn't have this kind of support or exchange of information that we have or that we enjoy today. There was no research in the pipeline, and there weren't any commercial food products that were allergy safe. You couldn't even find an allergy-free cookbook. This was pretty difficult for a new mom like myself trying to feed my young family. I was a lousy baker. I was an even worse cook. And it really took quite a bit for me on this mission, this journey, to make sure that I could feed my family safely. Now, while I was enjoying my new normal, a few years later, my daughter here, Leia, who is now 21 and a senior in college, when she was 12, 2 or 3 weeks before her bat mitzvah, she was diagnosed with Crohn's disease. This is an autoimmune disease where your immune system attacks the lining of your small intestine. Now, if you know nothing about your small intestine, here's what you should know. It is the powerhouse of nutrient absorption. Everything you eat, medicines you take, the nutrients get absorbed into your gut, sent out to what they need to do in the rest of your body. And if your gut is ravaged or inflamed, then you are not thriving. My daughter was 12. She was 35 pounds underweight, multiple hospitalizations, and she had stunted growth. She was no longer growing. And getting her to remission was a mission. Now, around these 2 events is where I started making different connections to food. I'm a girl who used to grab a brownie, and I'm dating myself, a Tab, which was the pink Diet Coke of its time. And here I was really trying to understand how food and autoimmune disease were connected. But it was more than that. More importantly, I started to learn about connecting and embracing the concept of food from an emotional and an intentional standpoint. When your kid can't eat what everybody else eats on a holiday or a party or whatever, you want to make sure that you can still bring a level of Jewish connection to your family, a level of tradition. And this is where things for me started to change. And when I started this company, I decided to use my love of Jewish learning along with my passion and education on healthy living to bring it to you here today, and here we are. So I'd like to start off with a quote, because your food is the only thing that truly understands you. Now, I'd like to tell you that this comes from a venerable sage from the Talmudic era, but I told you that I was a girl from Flushing, Queens. This is actually a quote from the nanny. I'm a big fan. And I actually had a friend who was who loved the nanny just as much as I did. And at one particular Seder, she asked me if I could do one of the 4 questions a la Fran Drescher. I was like, oh, sure. Why is this night different from all the other nights? Well, tonight we get to eat all the food. Oh, Mr. Sheffield. But seriously, I love this quote because it is a testament to food as a holistic act. It is the holistic experience. We feel things when we eat. We feel joy, we feel sadness, we feel gladness, we remember things. And while the characters on the show were undoubtedly Jewish stereotypes, especially the overbearing Jewish mother played by the fabulous Renee Taylor. By the way, I used to think that was hysterical, the overbearing Jewish mother, until I actually became a Jewish mother myself and then realized I was the butt of all those jokes. Then it wasn't so funny anymore. But I love the fact that the two of them, no matter what argument that they were in, if there was food on the table, it brought them together. It was a connection. It was their love language. It was the great equalizer. And that's what food is supposed to be. It's supposed to bring us together through different levels of connection. And this is the concept that we're going to be exploring today from 3 different angles. So we're going to start off with a little nutrition because I'm a health coach. We're going to talk about food from an emotional standpoint because I'm a health coach and I'm a former social worker. And then we're going to look at food from a cultural and a Jewish experience because I'm a Jewish health coach and former social worker. But the interesting thing is, as a health coach, people assume that I solely focus on calories in, calories out, don't eat this, eat that. People tend to hyper focus on that physical side of that triangle we mentioned earlier. And when we start to focus constantly just on that piece, people tend to ignore or deprive or deny themselves of the emotional aspect. It's almost as if, at least in terms of the clients that I work with, they are afraid to admit that there's an emotional component because they're afraid they're going to become emotional overeaters. And that's simply not true. And when that happens, we tend to apply a morality to food. Oh, I feel so guilty. I ate that food. Oh my God, I can't believe it's so bad. I'm so bad. All these types of narratives that are in our head. And the thing is that we actually need to embrace the emotional component. We need to deal with it appropriately, just like we talked about that mental emotional side on your triangle. We need to acknowledge foods and their emotional effects on us if we're going to embark or maintain a healthy wellness journey. And part of that journey is to really live intentionally and love the food you're eating, holiday, life cycle, what have you. So we're going to talk a little bit today about what it means to open up to the emotional aspect of food and its intentions. And then lastly, we're going to talk about how Jewish culture affects our intentions with different narratives that you may or not even realize are rolling around in your head from well-meaning parents or grandparents or what have you. So again, being in this type of field, I start to see patterns. And here are 2 of the biggest statements I hear all the time. 1, I hear that clients are always hungry. And 2, I hear I'm always eating or I'm eating too much. What happened? Why, how can I control that? And the fact is that these 2 polar opposite statements are actually very much connected. When we don't honor our hunger for whatever reason, whether by choice or by accident, or you find yourself, very hungry because you didn't plan your meals out properly, we tend to overeat. So we're going to look at a few basics regarding keeping our metabolic motors running. And the reason why I'm including this little mini nutritional lesson is because when we understand what actually makes us happy, what keeps our bodies happy, full, and nourished, our relationship with food is improved, allowing us to fully enjoy and live more intentionally. So what I tell clients is to live by the Holy Trinity. That is protein, carbohydrates, and healthy fats. Now, protein is actually not used for energy. Protein helps maintain and replace tissues. It is your body's main building block. And muscle, connective tissue, and skin are all built of protein. Protein is critical to keeping your independence. because we start to lose muscle mass as early as our 30s. And when that happens, that's when things start to go awry. We can't walk as well. We can't lift as well. You can't lift a box or push the grocery cart. It's those, everyday functional abilities, because protein is connected to your joints. And if you are not keeping up with your protein, if you're not maintaining your muscle mass and you're losing it, you're also losing your independence. Then there's our carbohydrates. Now, carbohydrates have been scandalized for I can't even tell you how long. Started in probably, I believe, the early 90s with the protein power diet and Atkins, and now we have keto. But the truth is that carbohydrates are your body's preferred source of energy. It gives your brain and muscles fuel. It's nutrients that you need to keep you going. Think complex carbohydrates. Fruits, vegetables, legumes, whole grains, but there's also your simple carbohydrates, your sugars, your cookies, your cakes, and there is room for both of them to coexist. And then we have our fat. Again, another macronutrient that has been scandalized for I can't even tell you how long. We all lived through the low-fat craze, and it really didn't get anybody anywhere. Fat is the slowest source of energy. It is typically the last avenue your body taps into energy because it's going for the carbohydrates first. And your body needs fat for growth and energy. It uses fat to synthesize hormones and other substances needed for your body's activities. And it also helps absorb nutrients like vitamin A, vitamin D, and vitamin K. And then finally, even though it's not part of the Trinity, fiber is so important. Most of us don't get enough. I like to think of fiber as nature's scrub brush. It absorbs cholesterol in your digestive tract so that it can help eliminate it. It stabilizes your blood sugar and it feeds good gut bacteria. If you're eating, enough of your complex carbohydrates, then you're most probably getting enough fiber. And then finally, because I'm a health coach and I always have to drive this point home, drink more water. 75% of Americans are chronically dehydrated. And when we're dehydrated, it affects our cognitive thinking. It causes poor muscle coordination and fatigue. Basically, water is your body's natural irrigation system. But how does food make us feel? Well, food is more than calories and macronutrients, and the emotional side of food is complex, and it can sometimes be confusing. Now, please don't mistake my emotional, my views on food and emotion for being, what's the word? Like if somebody comes to me and says, oh my God, my dog died, I'm so sad. And I'm like, you know what would really help you if you went out and bought yourself a cheesecake? It's a little more nuanced than that. But food is more than calories and macronutrients. It's intentional. Our holidays, our life cycle events are based on food. And this goes back to the triangle and how we deal with our emotional side. It means that we have to honor those emotions. And I love this quote, the taste of a memory, that we see every year when we get to Passover. It's on the Strides box. I love it because it conjures up visions of Bubby at the Helm or Shabbat dinners or holidays, because food and what it represents is basically the fabric of our tradition and our Jewish cultural narrative. It evokes good associations and it evokes bad associations. Case in point, good associations. I remember I was very fortunate growing up to have a great grandmother around for quite some time. And I remember that before a holiday when she would stay with us, whether it was Passover or Sukkot, my mother would scour the grocery store looking for farmer cheese. Now, which was a throwback to my Bubby's Russian roots, as well as pumpernickel bread, like thick, dark pumpernickel bread. And my mother would always make sure that it was there for my Bubby when she came. And the thing is that I'm sure it was very different when she ate farmer cheese. I do believe from some of the research I did, it was kind of a different consistency living in Poland, but the American farmer cheese kind of looks like pressed cottage cheese, which is actually what I think it is. Now, I couldn't stand the look of it. But what I loved and what I still remember to this day is We were 3 generations of women sitting around the table with my bubby and her thick Yiddish accent, which I can't imitate as well as Fran Drescher, but she would sit there, darling, a bissel more with this mein coffee. And it was just, it's a lovely memory for me. And if I see farmer cheese, it kind of takes me back to thinking about my great bubby sitting around the table. Now, that's a good emotion. There's also bad. There was the tofurkey debacle of 1999. I know my parents are probably on this webinar and they're probably listening to what I am saying right now. My parents are vegetarian, and one year they served tofurkey at Thanksgiving. If you do not know what tofurkey is, consider yourselves lucky. If you do know what tofurkey is and you like it, then I apologize. But case in point, I am still traumatized. But food evokes feelings, good and bad. Cravings are also wrapped in emotions. Now, I think we need to really, decipher the difference between emotional eating and eating for an emotional, and eating and learning about an emotional experience. For example, cravings with a client. If somebody came to me and said, I crave sugar, or I crave salt, or what have you, I would look into it as maybe it's a hormonal imbalance, or maybe it's a vitamin deficiency or a nutritional deficiency. And I'm not talking about cravings like, you know, what you see in a romantic comedy where boy meets girl, boy dumps girl, girl goes to the 7-Eleven at 12 o'clock at night, you know, completely disheveled in her pajamas and reaches for the Ben & Jerry's. That's actually emotional eating. And there's a difference. Emotional eating is trying to fill a hole. It's not acknowledging the feelings and using food in lieu of trying to sit with those feelings and creating a solution or trying to deal with it appropriately. What I'm talking about is food giving, a craving, giving you a memory of an experience. For example, very recently, my uncle passed away, and between all the rushing around and going to New York, and I went multiple weeks to visit, one for the funeral and for Shiva, and then also to come visit my family. And I know all of you New Yorkers will agree with me when I tell you that the Belt Parkway is just a long stretch of road where dreams go to die. The traffic was insane, and I was just, by the time I actually got home from the second trip, I hadn't really had enough time to really pause for thought and to really process. So the next morning I woke up and I was having a strange craving for, of all things, soft-boiled eggs and toast. Now, we have not had eggs in our house for 15 years because I told you my son is allergic. And I was really had to sit for a moment why I was craving soft-boiled eggs and toast. And when I actually sat quietly and thought about it, I remembered that when I was a kid, my mom used to make me soft-boiled eggs and toast when I was sick. And I loved the way the runny egg would make the hard toast nice and mushy. And it wasn't actually soft-boiled eggs and toast that I was craving. What I was craving was that feeling of security. I was craving a time when my family was intact, when I didn't have to deal with family members passing away. That's what I mean about how cravings are sometimes wrapped in our emotions. Sometimes we're not actually craving the food, we're craving what the food represented. And food and the concept of intention is the heart and soul, like I said, of the Jewish food narrative. Our lives are wrapped up in these stories, both good and bad. And it's our choice how we use these stories to create a positive impact. So in terms of positive impact and stories, when I was young, probably about 10 or so, my parents and I would always go, my family, we would go to synagogue every week. Now, rain, snow, sleet, hail, I mean, the postman had nothing on us, but we used to go to synagogue and we would walk. And the lure of Kiddush was probably what got me out of bed most of those Saturday mornings, because it was a time where my parents would schmooze and talk to their friends and talk and talk and talk. And I had free reign to pilfer through Kiddush. And it seemed like I had an obsession for mandel bread. Well, the jig was up when my parents were always discovering crumbs kind of flying out of my pockets. I kind of had to put a halt. I was watched a little more like a hawk when we went to shul for Kiddush. But we had some family friends, my Aunt Helen and my Uncle Saul. They were not related to me. Aunt Helen was a lovely petite woman, and we used to walk to synagogue with her. And she got wind of this story, and she said, I will make you mandel bread, and I'll bring it to you. And I'm like, really? And she said, yes, my mandel bread is so much better than the mandel bread you get at synagogue. And I was like, okay. But she not only just brought me mandel bread. I mean, when Aunt Helen showed up to your house with a tinfoil mound, you knew it was a mandel bread. But she did it on a consistent basis. And my dad and I are kind of addicted, or at least we were, to mandel bread. So I guess you could call my Aunt Helen our mandel bread pusher. But she would give it to us on a regular basis, maybe twice a month, or every other week, or what have you. The fact that she took time out, and mandel bread, now that I make mandel bread on my own, mandel bread requires a lot of work. There's the mixing of ingredients, and then there's the loaf shaping, and then you have to bake it, and then cut it, and then sprinkle, and then twice bake it. It's a lot. Aunt Helen had a full-time job, and she had children, and yet she found time to make me happy. So much so that I am still talking about this, some 45 years later. I'm still remembering that positive impact she had just by bringing me homemade mandel bread. And of course she was right. It was completely different than the anemic looking stuff I ate at synagogue. It was, it was bumpy, and it was crunchy, and it was soft on the inside. She put lots of chocolate chips, and it was really so endearing to me, even at a young age, that I still carry that story with me today. We all carry these stories, both good and bad. And what do we do with them? That's the big question. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But this kind of concept, this intention, this idea about food creating a positive impact, all comes down to, we are actually getting into a Talmudic sage now. Fran is long gone. Im ein kemach ein Torah, im ein Torah ein kemach. Literally translated, if there is no flour, there is no Torah. If there's no Torah, there is no flour. Now, kemach, literally in Hebrew, means flour, but the rabbis interpret it as wages or sustenance. Now, think about it. Think about the term dough. It's a mid-19th century term. I got to make the dough. I got to make the bread, right? So what they're saying here is that if you don't have a job, if you're not making any money, you need a livelihood so that you can make money, so that you can buy bread, so that you can be full, so that you can study words of Torah. Well, what exactly does that mean? Well, Torah is our blueprint. It's our instructions for living. And the rabbis considered taking care of one's health, physical health, as paramount. Why? Well, one's physical body houses the soul. And if your body wasn't healthy, then you weren't able to achieve your spiritual purpose. There's that spiritual part of our triangle. You needed to achieve a certain level of holiness. So just to give you a little brief background on who wrote this proverbial nugget, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was a Jewish rabbinic scholar. He lived in the late 1st to early 2nd century. And at that time, it was probably about a decade or two after the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans. And he was the youngest person to head the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was basically the Supreme Court of its day, and it was ruled by 71 sages, and the head was called the Nasi. The Nasi was also the head, or the Rosh Yeshiva, which was the center of Jewish academics. And Rabbi Gamliel was the head. They wanted to depose him because he was ruling with an iron fist. He wasn't letting new people come into the academy. They went to Elazar ben Azariah, who was a scholar even at his young age. He was also coming from a wealthy family, which always helped. But some sources say he was 16 and some sources say he was 18. Either way, he was pretty young and he didn't look like a sage. And when he went home to his wife said, well, you don't look like a sage. Who's going to take you seriously? And the midrash is the next day he woke up and he had a long beard and he had 18 rows of hair, gray hair. And he and Rabbi Gamliel actually shared the position. And eventually the position went back to Rabbi Gamliel. But the no flour, no Torah is that we need food and drink to live. You know, bread is the basic food that supports life. And only when we have these necessities can we devote ourselves to higher pursuits such as study. And, you know, a couple of years ago, Snickers had a really funny marketing campaign where they used different celebrities like Abe Vigoda and they used Betty White. But what happens when we're hungry? This is actually the secular version of Ein Kemach, minus the Torah study. But you're not you when you're hungry. What happens when we're hungry? We're tired, we're lethargic, we have a headache, our physical abilities are limited and our cognition is impaired. We can't make good decisions. I mean, think about when you're really hangry. We use that term all the time. And we're not in the right frame of mind, where we yell at people or, you know, especially when you're driving. So you're not you when you're hungry. This is what the rabbis are saying. If you're not satiated, you're not going to be able to focus on your spiritual enlightenment. But I'd like to expand that translation just a little bit, and that it's more nuanced than a primal need for sustenance. We need more. It's more than just food. Food is, there's that triangle. Food is a holistic act. It combines the physical, the emotional, the spiritual, and it's not just the consuming of food, it's the giving and it's the receiving of food. It's intention creating a positive impact in our own lives and around the world. And think about your own stories. You know, think about maybe making your life-affirming chicken soup and giving it to a friend. I had a friend who was going through a very difficult medical procedure. I channeled my inner Aunt Helen and I told her that I would make her mantel bread and it would be waiting for her when she got home from the procedure. I dropped it off at her house. Her young daughter took the bag from me and I told her, not one piece, it's all for your mom. Well, to her credit, she did not eat any of the mantel bread, but she also forgot to tell her mother that I delivered it. So when I had not heard from the mom, I finally made a phone call at 10:30. I'm like, did you get the mantel bread? She's like, I was just about to call you. Rebecca forgot to tell me it was here. And I was so disappointed when I came home and it wasn't here. She said, I ate every last piece. Thank you so much. That's what I'm talking about. Positive impact, paying it forward. And it's, again, it's not just eating the food. It's, you know, I know Suzanne, you're out there. I remember you telling me that you love to put out a big spread for Sukkot, as do I, because it makes us feel good when we can give back to our friends, when we can see them enjoying a holiday meal, when we're all together connecting. So how does our Jewish culture affect our intentions? Now, when I was in Hebrew school, we had to watch this movie. This scene comes from Goodbye Columbus. I don't know, many of you may know the movie with Jack Klugman, and I was very obsessed with Ali McGraw at the time, but we had to watch it in Hebrew school. And in Hebrew high school, we were having a lesson on brachot, on blessings. And this scene, which is the wedding scene, everybody is just, it really affected me, even at a young age. Everybody is just shoveling food. Nobody's eating with thought or intent. There's one scene where Jack Klugman walks over to a chopped liver chicken and he like takes a knife and he just slices the head off and he smears it on a piece of rye bread and he shoves it in his mouth. Nobody's thinking about the event or the connection. They're just shoveling it in. Very gluttonous. And the thing is Judaism, it kind of reminds me a little bit of, those New Yorkers, you know what I'm talking about the schmorg, the smorgasbord. So the smorgasbord is basically, you go to any event and there's enough food at the cocktail hour to feed a third world country. And then you have a 3-4 course dinner, and then there's a dessert table. And then just in case you're still hungry, when you leave, don't forget to take your hot pretzel or your cookie, because you must be starving after eating all of that. And the schmorg has actually gotten a lot schmorgier over the years, at least in terms of some of the events that I have been to. And Judaism teaches us that we should be intentional. And it teaches us that when we do things like hamotzi, blessing over the bread, and other blessings over food, these blessings make us pause for thought. They elevate us as humans. We appreciate having the food. We appreciate who made it, its taste, its texture, and its representation. So here's another reason why sometimes our intentions go awry. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard this term or this saying, eat all your food on your plate, because there are starving people in fill in the blank, in Europe, in Ethiopia, in Africa, what have you. And the thing about this quote is that it sets us up automatically to feel guilty about food, which is a negative emotion. Whether you eat the food or not, their situation isn't going to change. But what is going to change is that you're going to develop a warped relationship with food, because you're always going to feel guilty. That's not to say that we should throw food out, but we shouldn't be eating so much food that we can't finish, or food that we don't like, because we don't want to feel guilty. So, like I said, it sets us up for a warped experience. And these are the kinds of narratives that are buried deep in our psyche, because we actually do come from a culture where a lot of it is based on oppression. Let's think about it for a second. If you think about some of our holidays, let's take Passover. The whole basis of Passover, we're eating matzah for 8 days because the Jews were leaving Egypt. They needed to be very quick so Pharaoh wouldn't change his mind. So they put the dough on their backs and they let it bake in the sun, because they didn't want to starve in the desert, because we were fleeing oppression, because they didn't want to have food scarcity in the desert. So the other thing is when they're wandering in the desert and, God gives them manna from heaven. I actually do a program on this called Bread and All Its Twisted Relationships. God sending them manna was his way of saying, don't worry, I got you. I will always give you food. But the children of Israel who were wandering the desert, who had just been slaves, they had food scarcity. And there were rules about the manna. You were not allowed to collect more than you could eat that day. So if you hoarded it, which people do, when you hoarded the manna, the next day, anything that you didn't eat turned putrid. So again, food scarcity, oppression. And if we just look back to the first year of the pandemic, where people were hoarding things off of the shelves, it was based on fear. And a lot of these things are based on fear, because we come from a culture that was based on oppression and, living in the shtetl or the Holocaust. We have Holocaust mentality, we have shtetl mentality, and we preserve a lot of that tradition with adopting some of the poverty cuisine that we eat. Think about that. I mean, we're going to talk a little bit about some of these different cuisines that we look at as comfort food, but really came from a place of oppression, where you would feel guilty if you wasted something. And these narratives create like these bad emotional behaviors, and we may not even realize where these narratives in our head came from, maybe from a well-meaning parent or a well-meaning grandparent. But when we talk about shtetl mentality and Holocaust mentality, NIH actually did a study a few years ago. It was actually in the early 2000s, where they interviewed Holocaust survivors and wanted to understand their attitudes toward food. And they came up with various different themes. One theme was that Holocaust survivors had difficulty throwing away food even when it was spoiled. They hoarded, they stored a lot of excess food. They craved certain foods, whether that was because they had been restricted, so terribly restricted when they were living in the concentration camps, or whether it was emotional. They craved certain foods from their childhood when they were intact, when this wasn't happening. They had difficulty standing in line, even at the grocery store, for food, and they experienced anxiety when food wasn't readily available. So this is what I'm talking about in terms of the narratives that are in our head that are sort of entrenched in our culture. So let's talk about a few of these poverty cuisine dishes. So cholent is supposed to be the ultimate comfort food. Now, the fact of the matter is that cholent was also, it is poverty cuisine. It basically was a stew. You were able to grab whatever you had available, whether it was potatoes or bits of vegetable, or if you were lucky enough to have meat. They would put it in the shtetl, they would put it in a pot, they would seal it with like a flour water paste, and they would walk it over to the baker who was just about to turn off his oven for Shabbat. They would place it in the oven and it would slow cook for 12 hours, and then they would have this hearty meal the next day for Shabbat. Now, this man, Irving Naxon, who originally was named Irving Nachumson, used to listen to the story about his mother, who was a young girl living in Lithuania, and how she was the pot carrier. And he was an inventor. And this is where the first crock pot was developed, because he wanted to create some kind of an appliance with an element that would slow cook the food. He actually didn't call it the crock pot at first. He sold the idea, the invention, and I think it was to a company called Rival, and they actually made the name crock pot. Gefilte fish. Now, interestingly enough, I'm going to be very authentic and honest. I am not a food historian. If you'd like to hear more about this stuff, or if you're really interested, I highly suggest you get one of Jo Nathan's books, because she is the ultimate in Jewish food history. But interestingly enough, gefilte fish did not start out as a Jewish food. Gefilte fish, the first mention of gefilte fish, comes from a 700-year-old non-Jewish German cookbook in which poached or mashed fish was flavored with herbs and mixed with seeds, and it was stuffed back into the skin and roasted, and it was a popular dish for Catholics during Lent. By the Middle Ages, the Catholic dish had migrated to the Jewish kitchen under the moniker of gefilte fish. And again, why is this considered poverty cuisine? Because you would scrape out the fish and then you would mix it with filler, egg or breadcrumbs or something like that, in order to expand it so that you could feed your family. And in fact, there were poor families that couldn't afford the whole fish. They would ask for just the head, and the skin would be stuffed with bread and fillers, and the bones in the head would flavor the broth. So things like stews and soups were also very much a part of poverty cuisine, because it would fill you up. And then finally, we have Kugel, which was, diet of extreme poverty and insecurity. Now, the interesting thing about Kugel, in addition to the fact it was made from cheap ingredients, it was typically made in a round tin, is that this recipe didn't come from Poland per se. This recipe actually came from Jews who were expelled from France in the 13th and 14th century. And Germany had annexed a very southern part of France that the Jews actually had to go through as they were moving eastward to Poland, Russia. And that is where Kugel came from. So as we wind down a little bit, and we've talked about the nutritional and the emotional and the cultural aspects, I want you to remember that we can shift our mindsets. And again, this doesn't apply to everybody. This is just something that I have noticed working in this field. We need to accept who we are and where we come from. Our past is an incredibly important part of who we are. It's an incredibly important part of our culture, but it doesn't define us as individuals. And food is about intent. It is about gratitude. It is about nourishment, comfort, and enjoyment. And I think once we start really thinking about food, not just as that calorie in, calorie out, how, how much should I eat of this and how much should I eat of that? When we start to really look at food and everything that involves it, that's when you are truly on a wellness journey. Food shouldn't make us feel guilty. We need to take the morality out of food. I hear it all the time. In fact, I was the biggest proponent of it. I used to say, oh, I can't believe I ate it. Oh my God, I feel so guilty. Oh, I had so much. And when I heard other people saying it, it really kind of clicked, especially since I had children that couldn't eat certain things. And when that happens, that really plays with your head. I had my daughter was getting to remission and she was restricted from a lot of different things. So who was I to say, oh, I can't believe I feel so guilty? That's when the morality for me started to change. And, food, it's an emotionally, it's spiritually centric, and we need to embrace that. And that, my friends, is all I have for you today. I'm so glad that I was with all of you. I was able to talk to you about food. You can tell that I'm very passionate about what I do. Please feel free to reach out to me. You have my website here. I know, Suzanne, I'm going to pass it on to you, and you have other information. It was a pleasure being with all of you today, and thank you so, so much.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I know you mentioned me and Sukkot, and listening to you, it made me think about the reason my family does a big Sukkot celebration every year is it comes from my childhood of remembering that my neighbor, the Cataldos, every year had a sukkah and invited all the friends and family. And I just have these deep memories and joy of going and celebrating Sukkot with them. And so that's how my family started their sukkah celebration. And I know that that's become a big part of a lot of my friends' families. And so I really resonate with that. So somebody asked, since your kids have so many food restrictions, how do you cope with holiday time? And I'll also, a lot of vegetarians and vegans, and our holiday has typically been around brisket and chicken. So how do you deal with a holiday when there's people with so many different types of food requirements?
That's a really good question. I actually wrote a blog a few years back called My Big Fat Vegan, Vegetarian, Egg-Free, Nut-Free, Salt-Free, Carnivore Thanksgiving, or something like that. Because I have a vegetarian daughter who was also restricted, and I had the nut-free and the egg-free, and then I had another relative who was on a low salt diet. Here's what I tell people, because I work with a lot of people who have a lot of different issues, autoimmune disease, and everybody's on a different protocol. The thing is that you have to keep it simple. You can find a few good recipes that don't have any of those elements, and I could always send out a list if anybody is interested in them, but it's really important to keep it simple. When I first started on this journey, especially with food allergies, I thought it was so important for me to prove to everybody that you could still eat, the same things, just, I made them differently. And it started to become a deterrent for me, because it started to become so difficult. Once you simplify the process, once you take out the certain ingredients, and you find replacements for them, you can make similar items that everybody can enjoy. And it's all a part of that intention. You want to make sure that your guests are comfortable. I have been to meals where they're like, well, we can't give anything to your son, so I don't know what I'm going to serve. And I don't play into that. When somebody comes to my house and they have an issue, I'm going to work with that issue. So if you're looking for a vegetarian, a vegan, there are so many things that can be made. You can stick with vegetables. You can stick all sorts of roasted vegetable dishes. You can make a kugel without eggs. You can serve meat to the carnivores, but then always make sure that there's a protein for your vegetarians. It's really not as difficult as people think it is, but it is really important to keep it as simple as possible. Mm-hmm. I hope that answers your question.
Yep. One question is, what can parents and grandparents do with their kids and grandkids to help build a love of food without the guilt?
That is an Excellent question. I think we need to be very careful about some of our verbiage. You know, sometimes we say things we don't even realize the impact that our kids are picking up. I feel telling a kid to finish everything on their plate is a big, you know, that can be a big no-no, because then the child starts to really develop like a very warped relationship with food. We don't have to finish our plate. I also have said to my kids, you know, you need a protein or you need this, but the fact of the matter is that as long as your children are eating relatively healthy, not every meal has to be perfect. It's really more of a cumulative effect, you know. So if you didn't have fruit one day, but you're having fruit throughout the week, that's okay. But I think it's really important to really be very careful about what we say around children in terms of food and having to finish, or how they look, or you didn't finish that, or things like that. I think when we do that, we kind of take that whole guilt aspect out of it.
Thank you. Someone said in your slide about your slide that showed the mandel bread, excuse me, was that an actual recipe? Because it said gluten-free, but somebody wanted to know gluten-free what?
Yes, it was an actual recipe. The gluten-free that the person saw, that recipe was probably made. I have multiple mandel bread recipes. I'm always trying to improve. It was probably made with oat flour. Oats are naturally gluten-free, so I use it a lot in baking, especially if I'm making something gluten-free. The thing that you need to be most careful about when it comes to gluten-free, especially with oat flour, is that your oat flour has to say on the package gluten-free, because oat flour may naturally be gluten-free, but where it is grown is not. So it can be cross-contaminated with other, you know, wheat fields in the field or in a factory that's processing other flours. So always make sure, if you do use oat flour, to make sure that the bag says gluten-free if you need gluten-free.
Just to let you know, we do have a tofurkey fan out there.
Well,
my
parents are still talking to me. I mean, I brought up the tofurkey debacle.
I don't think it was them. What's your favorite?
It was probably them.
What's your favorite holiday, and what's your least favorite holiday from a food perspective?
So we'll start with my least. We'll go with bad first, good second. My least favorite holiday is Passover. And now it's gotten better over the years, but when we first were introduced to food allergies, Passover was the hardest holiday, because the hallmarks, the foundations of Passover cooking are almonds, walnuts, and eggs. And it's pretty hard, you know, to make a matzo ball. I actually wrote an article about it for the Baltimore Jewish Times called Tales of a Vegan Matzo Ball. It was all about my frustration trying to make an eggless matzo ball. So it is still, even though it has gotten incredibly easier over the years, because I try to keep it simple, it is still very difficult for me to always try to come up with, you know, new creations for Passover without eggs. My favorite holiday to prepare for, though it's not my favorite holiday is Sukkot. But my favorite holiday to prepare for is actually Rosh Hashanah, because it's the beginning of all of those traditional foods. Now, I use the same traditional foods because I like to keep it simple. So if I make a carrot mousse for Rosh Hashanah, you're going to get it for Thanksgiving, and you're going to get a Passover edition, and you're going to get a Sukkot edition. But I like it because Rosh Hashanah is the head. It's the beginning. It's when all of those, you know, we've gone through a long dry spell of no holidays, and then all of a sudden you're making all these traditional foods that everybody loves. So I like cooking for Rosh Hashanah.
Do you have a favorite recipe or a favorite dish, Jewish dish, whether it's for Rosh Hashanah or another holiday?
My favorite is mandel bread. It started me, I was young. My Aunt Helen kind of like gave me the itch to make it myself. I love it. I admit I'm a mandel bread addict. I will eat it any time of day. I will eat it on a holiday, or I will eat it when it's not a holiday.
Sounds like a Dr. Seuss book.
It's too hot.
Sounds like a Dr. Seuss book. Well, that is about all the time we have today. I will be sending out an email to everybody that registered with a link to today, as well as a link to Rachel's Sukkot children's book and her MatzoBall Fitness website. Rachel, if you would be so kind, some people have asked if you could share one of your mandel bread recipes, and I can include it to everybody. And there were a few personal questions that I will save to give to you. And you can respond to people directly. Again, thank you, Rachel, for joining us. We wish everybody a good week and look forward to the high holidays coming up. You can hopefully use some of the lessons that Rachel shared today. And we will go to momentmag.com where you can sign up for our next Zoominar. Again, we'll see everybody next time. Thank you.
Thank you.